By the time the valley called it the worst fever season anyone living could remember, most people in Cedar Bend had long since stopped repeating the joke about the horse doctor's notice, though for one particular morning in early spring, it had seemed to half the town like the funniest thing to happen there in years. Nobody gathered outside the feed store that day, expecting to remember it as the morning everything started. They had only come to see who'd be fool enough to answer an advertisement for work with sick and dying animals. Josephine Hale walked into Cedar Bend on a Tuesday with a leather satchel worn soft at the corners, buckled shut over instruments her father had carried for 30 years before her, a fleam and a drenching horn, and a case of surgical tools kept oiled and sharp out of habit, long after there'd been anyone left to use them on but herself. Her father had been a horse doctor 2 counties east, well regarded in his day, and had taught her everything he knew across a childhood spent riding beside him, to ailing stock rather than sitting in a schoolhouse. Because he'd had no sons and had decided early that a daughter with steady hands and a strong stomach was worth more to him than any list of subjects a proper school might have covered. He had died that winter of a fever no different in kind from the ones he'd spent his life curing in other creatures, and Josephine had buried him and sold what little property remained to cover his debts, and arrived in Cedar Bend with the satchel and almost nothing else, because she had heard from a drover passing through her old county that the horse doctor here had posted a notice looking for help and had not yet found any. The notice was still pinned to the board outside the feed store when she arrived, hand-lettered and plain. Wanted, assistant to horse doctor, steady hand, strong stomach, willing to learn. Inquire at Reeves. Josephine read it twice, checked the address against the small clinic building she could see down the street, its shingle reading C. Reeve. Horse doctor in the letters, gone silver with weather, and walked toward it with the satchel over her shoulder and no particular expectation of trouble, because in her father's county nobody had thought twice about a woman handling sick stock, not once they'd seen her work. Cedar Bend thought differently, or at least the half-dozen men already gathered outside the clinic that morning did, drawn by the same notice and clearly under the impression that the position belonged, by simple virtue of the work involved, to one of them. Gideon Marsh stood at the front of the loose gathering, a horse trader with a business 2 streets over and an opinion of his own qualifications that exceeded, by most accounts, his actual skill with sick animals. And when Josephine stopped at the edge of the group and asked, plain and steady, whether this was the right place to inquire about the notice, Gideon looked her over with the particular condescension of a man who has never once doubted his own place in the world, and finds it faintly insulting that anyone else might claim similar ground. Inquire about what, exactly? Gideon said, loud enough that the others around him took the cue to laugh before he'd even finished the thought. You planning to hold the horse's head while one of us does the doctoring, ma'am? Because I'll tell you plain, this ain't work for a woman. You'll faint dead away first time you've got to lance an abscess or pull a breech full, and Reeves got no time to be catching fainting women when there's animals dying. The laughter that followed was not unkind exactly, not in the way real cruelty is unkind, but it carried the particular sting of being laughed at rather than with the sting of a stranger deciding, in front of an audience, what you were and were not capable of before you'd said a single word in your own defense. Josephine felt the old humiliation rise, the same helplessness she'd felt at her father's graveside being told by well-meaning neighbors what would become of her now that she had no man left to provide for her, decided by others, spoken over her head as though she weren't standing right there to hear it. She had promised herself, packing that satchel in the empty house that no longer belonged to her, that she would not let any town's laughter decide who she was. She looked at Gideon Marsh, at his clean-pressed coat that had clearly never once been near a sick animal that morning, and said, clear enough that the whole gathering heard it, I've pulled 6 breech foals with my own 2 hands before I was 17, Mr. Marsh, and never fainted once, though I understand the impulse might strike different men different ways when the work gets hard. I'll let the horse doctor decide for himself whether I'm fit for the position, if it's all the same to you," and turned toward the clinic door before Gideon had recovered enough to answer her, though she heard behind her the laughter falter and shift into something less certain, the sound of a joke that had not landed the way its teller intended. The clinic door opened before she reached it. Behind her, the yard had gone quiet in the particular way a crowd goes quiet when it senses it has just watched something more interesting than the joke it came for. Thunder and Josephine, standing at the threshold with her father's satchel still heavy on her shoulder, felt the whole of the morning balance itself on whoever stepped through that door next. Caleb Reeve was 34 years old, broad through the shoulders in the way of a man who did his own restraining of half-wild stock rather than paying hands to do it, with a quiet, watchful manner that had served him well in a trade where reading an animal's fear correctly could mean the difference between a clean examination and a broken hand. He had heard most of the exchange through the open window while finishing a poultice at his workbench, and he came out now, wiping his hands on a rag, taking in the scene with the same careful attention he'd have given a horse he didn't yet know the temperament of. Gideon Marsh, red-faced and cornered by his own joke, a stranger in a travel-worn coat, standing straight-backed at the clinic steps with a satchel that Caleb noted immediately had the particular worn shine of tools kept in real use over many years. "You'd be answering the notice," he said to her, not a question exactly, and Josephine nodded. "Josephine Hale. My father doctored horses in Ashford County for 30 years. I trained under him since I was old enough to hold a fleam steady." She did not soften it with apology or over-explain herself the way she might have felt tempted to a year before when her father was still alive to vouch for her. She simply stated the facts and let them stand on their own weight. "I understand you're looking for an assistant." Caleb looked past her at Gideon, and the other men still gathered at the edge of the yard, clearly waiting to see how this would resolve. And something in him, some old dislike of watching a person get sized up by a crowd before they'd had a fair chance to prove themselves, made him decide the matter faster than he might otherwise have. "There's a gelding in the back stall took a bad step in a gopher hole yesterday," he said, favoring the near foreleg, swelling above the fetlock. "I'd value a second opinion before I commit to a treatment, if you'd care to look at him." It was, Josephine understood immediately, both a test and a courtesy, an invitation to prove her claim rather than simply take her word for it, offered without the theater Gideon had made of his doubt, and she found she did not resent it the way she might have resented Gideon's laughter, because this was the kind of doubt a serious person extended to any stranger claiming skill they hadn't yet witnessed, man or woman both, and there was a fairness in that she recognized and respected. "I'd be glad to," she said, and followed him around to the back stalls, aware of Gideon and the others drifting closer to watch, unable to help themselves. The gelding was a big, rangy bay, nervous with pain, ears pinned when Josephine approached the stall, and she did not rush the approach, took a moment first simply standing at the door, letting the animal take her measure, speaking low and even the way her father had taught her, before she moved in to run her hands down the swollen leg. Feeling for heat, for the particular give of a soft tissue injury versus the harder wrongness of a fracture, watching the horse's eyes and ears for the flinch that would tell her more than the leg itself could. "Not broken," she said after a moment. "Quiet, professional." All trace of the confrontation outside gone from her voice, now that she was doing the work she'd come to do. "Strained tendon, not the bone. I'd poultice it cold for the swelling today, then switch to a warm compress and complete rest for at least 2 weeks. No exception made for how sound he looks before that, because a tendon re-injured too early heals worse the second time than the first. I'd also check the other 3 legs careful, because a horse favoring one leg this hard will often strain a second compensating for it. And I don't like the stance he's holding on the off hind." Caleb crouched to check the hind leg she'd indicated and found. To his private satisfaction and his outward silence, exactly the beginning of the compensating strain she described, subtle enough that he might not have caught it himself for another day yet. He straightened, looked at her a long moment, and said, plain, the same way he said most things, "The job's yours if you want it, Miss Hale. Pays modest, but fair for the county. Room in the loft above the clinic if you need it. Separate stair from the house so there's no question raised about propriety. It's steady work through foaling season at least. Likely longer if it suits us both. I don't much care what Gideon Marsh or anyone else standing out there thinks about who I hired to help me. I care whether they can do the work." "Then I'll take it," Josephine said, and did not look toward the yard where Gideon and the others still stood, though she heard, behind her, the particular silence of men who had come expecting one kind of mourning and gotten an entirely different one instead. Gideon lingered a moment longer than the others, watching Caleb usher Josephine inside with the particular attention of a man recalculating something he'd assumed was settled, and then turned and walked off toward his own yard without further comment, though the walk had none of the swagger it had carried on his way over, and more than one man in the dispersing crowd noted the difference and carried the noticing with them into the stories they told over supper that night, stories that would, within a week, have Gideon's morning humiliation, traveling considerably further than he'd have liked. The clinic itself told Josephine most of what she needed to know about the man before he offered much of himself directly. A good building kept meticulously ordered, instruments cleaned and hung in careful rows, a shelf of veterinary texts read soft at the spines, and in the back room where he slept, visible through a half-open door she was not meant to notice, the particular bareness of a house that had never had a woman's hand shaping it. No curtains, no decoration beyond what function required. A life organized entirely around the animals that came through his doors, and very little left over for anything else. She learned quickly that Caleb Reeve said almost nothing that was not directly useful to the task in front of them, and that this reticence was not coldness but a kind of economy. A man who had learned early that a horse doctor's words mattered most when they were precise, because a wrong instruction, given carelessly, could cost an animal its life. And he seemed to have carried that precision into the rest of his speech, as a matter of habit rather than deliberate choice. He showed her his methods without condescension, corrected her only where correction was warranted, and within the first week had stopped explaining the basic procedures to her at all, trusting her competence enough to simply hand her the instruments and let her work while he attended to something else, which she understood. Without him ever saying so directly, as the highest compliment the man was likely to offer anyone. The stable hands and drovers who came through the clinic with their animals took longer to come around than Caleb had, and for the first weeks Josephine caught more than a few sideways looks, more than a few men who addressed their questions to Caleb, even when she was the one holding the instrument and doing the work, a habit born less of active hostility than of simple unfamiliarity with the shape of what they were seeing. She did not argue with the habit or make a point of correcting it. She simply kept working, kept diagnosing correctly, kept handling animals with a calm competence that spoke for itself louder than any argument could have, and let the slow accumulation of proof do what protest never would. The turn came, as it often did, through one particular animal, rather than any general campaign to change minds. A prize stallion belonging to a rancher named Otis Kane went down with severe colic on a night Caleb happened to be 2 hours out attending another case, and Kane's hands, desperate and out of options, rode hard for the clinic and found only Josephine there. And though the men's first instinct was clearly to wait for Caleb regardless of the animal's worsening condition, Josephine took charge of the situation with a calm that left no room for argument, walking the stallion for hours through the worst of the pain, administering the drench her father had taught her for exactly this ailment, watching for the signs that would tell her whether they were dealing with simple gas colic or something requiring surgical intervention she'd need Caleb for. And by the time Caleb returned near dawn, The stallion was past the crisis and resting easy. And Otis Kane, a hard, unsentimental man, not given to easy praise, told anyone who'd listened for weeks afterward that the new horse doctor's assistant had saved his best breeding stock single-handed, while half the valley's men stood around, wringing their hands. It was near the end of that same month, on an evening when the last of the day's patients had gone and the clinic had settled into its quiet hour, that Josephine found the loose latch on the instrument case Caleb kept for field calls, the leather strap worn through from years of use, and mentioned it to him, only in passing, expecting nothing more than acknowledgement, and found the case waiting for her the next morning with a new strap fitted, sturdy and well matched to the old leather. No comment offered about when he'd found the time to do it, or why he'd bothered with a repair that wasn't strictly his responsibility to make. Nothing said about the strap. She said nothing about it either, but she noticed, the way you notice a change in weather before anyone remarks on it, and something in her that had been careful and guarded since her father's death. Careful the way a person stays careful after losing the one steady thing in their life, eased another fraction that morning, running her thumb over the new stitching, before she packed the case for the day's rounds. The stable hands noticed the strap too, in the way small towns notice everything eventually, and while none of them said much about it directly, Josephine caught a shift in how they addressed her after that. Questions directed to her now as often as to Caleb. Requests for her opinion offered, without the hesitation that had marked those first weeks, as though the mended strap had become, without either of them intending it, a kind of public proof that the horse doctor himself had settled the question of her competence. Beyond any further argument, the quiet exchanges kept accumulating through the weeks that followed the way frost builds overnight, one thin layer at a time, until a whole field has changed color, without anyone marking the exact hour it happened. Josephine began leaving a cup of coffee at Caleb's elbow on the mornings he came in from an all-night foaling call, hot and made exactly as he liked it, though she'd only ever watched him make it for himself once to learn the proportions. And he began, without remark, setting aside the better cuts of meat when he butchered a hog for winter stores, more than the modest household needed, though he never said who the extra portions were meant for. She noticed her boots, worn thin from months of walking muddy stockyards, replaced one morning with a sturdier pair left outside her loft door. No note attached, sized, she realized with some private astonishment. Exactly right, which meant he had paid closer attention to the wear on her old boots than she had ever caught him doing. For his part, Caleb began to notice things about himself he was not entirely comfortable naming. He found he listened for her footstep on the loft stair before he admitted to himself he was listening for it. He found he preferred the field calls where she rode alongside him to the ones he made alone, even when the work itself required no second pair of hands, and told himself it was only practical, an extra set of eyes worth having on a difficult case, though he knew, turning the thought over in the quiet hours, that this was not the whole truth of it. It was a cold evening in late autumn, the two of them returning late from a difficult calving 2 farms over, riding side by side in a silence that had become comfortable between them rather than awkward, when Josephine's mare stumbled on the frozen ruts of the road and threw her hard enough to knock the wind from her. And Caleb was off his own horse and at her side before she'd fully registered what had happened, checking her over with the same careful, professional hands he used on an injured animal, though there was nothing professional in the way his voice shook slightly, asking whether she could feel her fingers, whether anything felt broken, and Josephine, catching her breath and finding nothing worse than a bruised hip and a badly frightened nerve, looked up at his face in the dim light, and saw there, plain and unguarded for once, something he usually kept carefully hidden behind his professional reserve, a fear that had nothing to do with a colicky horse, or a difficult foaling and everything to do with her. "I'm all right," she said, and meant it as reassurance, though something in the way she said it, And something in the way he continued kneeling beside her a beat longer than the situation strictly required told them both that more had just passed between them than a simple fall from a startled mare. "You gave me a scare," Caleb said, low, and it was as close as he had come, in all the months she'd known him, to admitting anything about the shape of what he felt. And Josephine, still catching her breath on the cold ground, found she was not entirely sorry for the fall, if this was what it had shaken loose in a man who otherwise kept everything so carefully contained. He helped her up with more gentleness than the injury strictly required, and they rode the rest of the way back to Cedar Bend, slower than necessary, neither one in any particular hurry to end the ride, and neither one saying anything further about what had happened on that dark stretch of frozen road, though both of them carried the memory of it home that night and turned it over privately in the quiet hours before sleep, the way a person turns over any moment they sense, even before they fully understand it, will end up mattering more than most. Josephine woke the next morning stiff through the hip where she'd landed, but otherwise unhurt, and found, coming down to the clinic, that Caleb had already been out before dawn to check the frozen ruts where the mare had stumbled, filling the worst of them in with gravel he'd hauled himself rather than wait for the county road crew to get to it in their own time, a fix that would spare every rider on that stretch a similar fall for months to come. Though he said nothing about having done it, and Josephine only learned of it a week later from a passing drover who mentioned, in passing, that the horse doctor had been out at first light filling potholes like a man with nothing better to do. And she understood, hearing it, exactly what he'd actually been doing out there, and exactly why he hadn't mentioned it himself. The moment that changed how the whole valley thought of Josephine Hale came on a bitter night in early winter, when a mare belonging to the Kane Ranch went into a difficult labor with a foal turned wrong in the womb, legs folded back instead of forward, the kind of breech that killed both mare and foal more often than not, if the correction wasn't made quickly and precisely by someone who knew exactly what they were reaching for in the dark, blind heat of a birth canal. Caleb had been called to a different emergency 3 farms distant and could not be reached in time. And Otis Kane, remembering the colic and trusting now without reservation, the woman who had saved his stallion, sent for Josephine, directly rather than waiting on the chance that Caleb might return in time. She arrived to find the mare in serious distress. Half the ranch's hands gathered in the barn with lanterns held high, faces grim with the particular helplessness of men watching a birth go wrong and having no idea how to fix it. And Josephine did not pause at the sight of the crowd the way she might have months before, did not feel the old need to prove herself to an audience. She simply rolled her sleeves, gave brief, clear instructions for how the mare should be held and steadied, and went to work, reaching in past the elbow to find the tangled legs of the foal, working by feel alone in the dark heat of the animal's body, patient even as the mare strained, and the men around her held their breath, correcting the position, one careful adjustment at a time, the way her father had taught her on a night much like this one, years before, guiding her own child's hands through the same procedure on a mare that hadn't survived, a lesson learned the hard way that she now put to use with a steadiness that gave no sign of the memory underneath it. It took the better part of an hour, the barn silent except for the mare's labored breathing and Josephine's low, even instructions. And when the foal finally came, wet and struggling, and very much alive, legs finding purchase under it within minutes in the straw, the barn erupted into the kind of relief that men who don't often show much emotion allow themselves only rarely. Otis Kane himself, hard and unsentimental, wiping at his eyes with the back of a dirty hand and declaring loud enough for the whole ranch to hear that he'd never in his life seen doctoring like it, man or woman, and that anybody in this valley still fool enough to laugh at a woman answering a horse doctor's notice ought to come see what that laughed-at woman had just done with her bare hands in the dark. Word of it moved through Cedar Bend, the way word of anything remarkable moves through a small town, fast and growing in the telling, and by the time Caleb returned from his own call 2 days later, he found the story already waiting for him at every stop he made, the details slightly different in each retelling, but the shape of it constant, that his assistant had saved both mare and foal alone, in the dark, with nothing but her own 2 hands and a steadiness that half the valley was now comparing favorably to his own. He found Josephine's at the clinic that evening, tired from the 2 sleepless nights, but otherwise unchanged by the sudden fame, cleaning instruments at the workbench with the same careful attention she brought to everything. And he stood in the doorway a long moment, watching her before he trusted himself to speak. "Otis Kane came by this morning, before I'd even unsaddled," he said. "Told me the whole thing twice, like I might not believe it the first time." He set down the bag he was carrying, slow, and something in his face had none of its usual professional reserve left in it. "I've delivered 100 foals in this valley, Josephine, breech and otherwise, and I don't know that I could have done what you did that night. Not alone, not in the dark, not without losing one or both of them." He paused, and the pause held the particular weight of a careful man working up to something he did not usually allow himself to say. "I think I stopped thinking of you as my assistant a while back, if I'm honest with myself about it. I'm not sure exactly when." Josephine set down the instrument she'd been cleaning and looked at him across the quiet clinic, the lamplight steady between them, and felt something settle in her chest that she had been holding carefully guarded since her father's death. The old fear of building a life around anyone only to lose them again, and found, looking at this quiet, careful man, standing in his own doorway with more honesty in his face than she'd ever seen him allow himself, that the fear did not feel as large as it once had. Not standing here, not after everything the past months had shown her about what kind of steadiness this particular man was built from. "I think I stopped thinking of myself that way a while back, too," she said, and neither of them said anything more about it that night, though the words sat between them afterward, like a door left deliberately unlocked, waiting for the right moment to walk all the way through. The Kane mare and her foal grew strong through that winter, and Otis Kane, true to his word, told the story of that night to anyone who would listen for months afterward, embellishing it a little further each time, until the version that finally settled into the valley's common memory had Josephine wrestling the foal into the world with something closer to legend than fact. Though the truth of it, patient hands working steady in the dark, needed no embellishment at all to be remarkable. The fever came down out of the north with the first hard freeze of true winter, carried in, as these things usually were, by a string of horses traded through from a county already known to be struggling with an outbreak, sold on before the sickness showed itself, and scattered across a dozen different stables before anyone understood what had arrived among them. It started with a cough in one of Gideon Marsh's trading stock, dismissed at first as nothing more than the ordinary complaint of animals hauled too far too fast in cold weather, and within a week had become something else entirely, a fever that swept through barn after barn with a speed that left no time for anyone to properly brace against it. Horses going down with labored breathing and swollen glands under the jaw, some recovering slow and weak, others not recovering at all. And by the second week of the outbreak, half the valley stables had at least one animal down with it, and no clear sense of how far it would spread before it burned itself out. Caleb and Josephine worked past exhaustion those weeks, riding from ranch to ranch through bitter cold, isolating sick animals from healthy ones, mixing what treatments existed for a fever that resisted most of them, sleeping in snatched hours between calls and sometimes not sleeping at all, and the valley that had spent months slowly warming to Josephine's presence found itself, in the crisis, relying on her without a second thought, because there was no room left in a dying animal's stall for anyone's old doubts about who was fit to doctor it. It was Gideon Marsh, predictably, who found in the crisis an opportunity rather than a shared burden. His own stock had been hit hardest, having been the first infected. And rather than accept responsibility for having sold and traded animals without proper caution, he began, in the way of men more comfortable with blame than accountability, to suggest around town that the fever's spread traced back not to his own careless trading, but to something closer to the clinic itself. Some failure of proper quarantine on Caleb and Josephine's part. Some negligence he implied without quite stating outright. Careful enough in his phrasing that it could not be easily disproven, and ugly enough in its implication to do real damage regardless. The suggestion found fertile ground in a town already frightened and exhausted, people watching their livelihoods sicken and die in stalls they'd built their whole futures around, looking for somewhere to place blame that wasn't the cold, indifferent fact of an illness nobody fully understood. And within days the whisper had grown into something louder, a faction of ranchers gathering to argue that the sick animals ought to be destroyed outright rather than treated, that Caleb and Josephine's methods were prolonging suffering and spreading contagion rather than containing it, that perhaps, as Gideon put it loudly enough for half the general store to hear, a horse doctor's assistant with no formal schooling had no business making decisions that affected the whole valley's herds, however lucky she'd gotten with one breech full on a quiet night. Josephine heard the worst of it from a stable hand, who delivered it apologetically, not wanting to add to her burden, but thinking she ought to know before she walked into a room, unprepared for what waited there. And she took the news the way she took most hard things, still on the surface, and kept working through the exhaustion, and the cold, and the mounting grief of animals they could not save despite everything. But that night, alone in the loft above the clinic, she let herself feel, briefly and privately, the old fear in full, the fear of a life and a reputation built on other people's shifting good opinion, one bad season away from losing everything she had worked to earn in this valley. The fear of watching her father's methods she trusted with her whole heart, dismissed by a frightened town, looking for someone easy to blame. Caleb heard it more directly, confronted outright by two of the ranchers, pushing hardest for the destruction of the sick stock. And something in him that had spent his whole career being patient and methodical and slow to anger went hard and still in a way the town had rarely seen from him. Not the stillness of a man too tired to argue, but the stillness of a man who had finally identified, with complete clarity, exactly what and who he intended to defend, whatever it cost him with the ranchers whose business he needed to keep his own clinic running. He called a meeting of his own that same evening, gathering the handful of ranchers he trusted most to hear him out plainly before the town's larger gathering could be swayed further by fear, laying out for them the actual treatment numbers he and Josephine had been keeping, case by case, and found in that smaller room the first solid ground he'd have to stand on when the wider argument came, as he already knew it would, to the Grange Hall. The town called a meeting at the Grange Hall the following Saturday, the largest gathering Cedar Bend had assembled since the fever started, every rancher in the valley, present or represented, because whatever came out of that meeting would decide the fate of every sick animal still standing in every barn for miles. And the mood in the hall when Caleb and Josephine arrived was the particular kind of fear-sharpened anger that makes reasonable people willing to do unreasonable things simply for the relief of doing something. Gideon Marsh had positioned himself near the front of the hall well before they arrived, having clearly spent the intervening days building his case among the ranchers most frightened by their losses. And he wasted no time once the meeting opened, standing to address the room with the practiced confidence of a man who has rehearsed his grievance more than once in front of a mirror. "We've lost near a third of the valley's horse stock to this fever already," he said, loud enough to carry to the back of the hall. "And I'll tell you plain what I told half of you already this week, that the treatment being administered out of Reeves' clinic isn't working fast enough to save the rest, and that a horse doctor's assistant with no formal training making life and death calls for this whole valley's herds is a risk none of us can afford to keep taking. I say we destroy the sick stock now, before it spreads further. And I say, we do it without further delay, while we've still got healthy animals left worth saving." A murmur moved through the hall, some voices raised in agreement, others clearly uncertain, the whole room balanced on a decision that would either save or waste every animal still fighting the fever in barns across the valley. And Josephine felt the old public helplessness rise in her chest, the sensation of being discussed and decided over rather than heard, the same feeling that had chased her out of Ashford County after her father's death and followed her, apparently all the way, here. She stood before Caleb Could, chin level, the same stillness she had worn on the clinic steps that first morning, waiting to see whether this town would let fear decide what it believed about her, without giving her the chance to answer for herself first. "Mr. Marsh is right that we've lost animals," she said, loud and clear enough that the whole hall quieted to hear it. "And every one of those losses sits heavy with me, same as it does with every rancher in this room. But I'd ask this valley to consider a few facts before it decides to start destroying animals that still have a real chance of recovery. The fever we're fighting entered this valley through traded stock brought in without proper quarantine, stock that came, as it happens, through Mr. Marsh's own yard before anyone knew what we were dealing with. The animals we've lost were, in every case I've examined, ones that went untreated too long before anyone called for help, not ones that failed to respond to the treatment once it was given. Of the horses we've caught early and treated properly, better than 2 in 3 have recovered fully. That's not a guess, Mr. Marsh. I've kept records of every case, and I'll show them to any rancher in this hall who wants to see the actual numbers rather than the fear." The hall had gone properly quiet now, listening in a way it hadn't listened to Gideon, and Caleb stepped up beside her, not to speak over her, but to stand with her. And when he did speak, it was directly to the room rather than to Gideon. "I've doctored horses in this valley for 10 years, he said, "and I'll tell you plain, I've never worked alongside anyone with steadier hands or better instincts than Josephine Hale, and any rancher in this hall who's had her out to their barn these past 3 weeks already knows that firsthand. Whatever Gideon Marsh wants to tell you about training, he's never bothered to ask a single question about. You want to destroy healthy animals with a real chance of recovery because one man's too proud to admit his own stock started this outbreak. That's your choice to make. But you'll make it knowing the actual facts, not the fear Gideon's been selling you all week." The hall sat with that a long moment, the silence stretching. And then Otis Kane stood, hard and unsentimental as ever, and said that he, for one, had watched Josephine Hale pull his own stallion back from death and his own mare's foal into the world with nothing but her bare hands and her father's training, and that he'd trust her numbers over Gideon Marsh's fear any day of the week. And one by one, other ranchers in the hall who'd had their own animals treated these past weeks stood to say something similar, until Gideon, cornered by the accumulating weight of a room, no longer willing to simply take his word for it, found his hat and left the hall without waiting for a formal vote. And the meeting, in the end, decided to continue treatment rather than destruction. A decision that would, over the following weeks, prove to have saved better than 24 animals that a hastier choice would have lost. They rode back to the clinic well after dark, the meeting having run long into the evening. The cold, sharp, and clear overhead, more stars out than the valley's few scattered lamps usually allowed anyone to see. The particular quiet that follows a hard fight once it has finally been won, and the exhaustion of the winning settles in behind the relief. Caleb saw to the horses in near silence, and when he came into the clinic afterward, Josephine was still at the workbench, the ledger of her fever treatment records open in front of her, though she wasn't really reading it anymore, and he stood in the doorway a moment before he came the rest of the way in. "You didn't need me standing up in that hall tonight," he said. "You'd already won the room before I said a word." "Maybe." Josephine closed the ledger, set it aside, "but I'm glad you stood anyway. There's a difference between winning an argument alone and having someone stand beside you while you make it. even if you could have managed without them. I've done enough of the first kind these past 2 years. I didn't mind the second kind tonight." He nodded, and there was a stillness in him that felt different from his usual professional reserve, less like a man holding something carefully contained, and more like a man finally clear enough in himself to let it show. "I'm not much for long speeches," he said. "Never have been. So I'll say this plain, the way I'd say most things that matter." He set his hat down on the workbench, deliberate, the way she'd noticed he only ever did when he meant to say something that cost him something to say. "I'm asking you to stay here permanent, Josephine. Not as my assistant anymore, though I'll be glad enough to keep working alongside you, doing exactly what we've been doing. As my wife, if that's what you'd want." He paused, and the pause held no uncertainty in it at all, only patience. "It's your choice, entirely yours, whichever way you decide. And you've got a place here regardless of the answer, same as you've had since the morning I hired you over Gideon Marsh's laughing. Take whatever time you need to be sure." He did not fill the silence that followed. He let it sit, unhurried, the way he let most things sit. And Josephine stood in the quiet clinic with the lamp burning low and thought of the feed store morning months before, of Gideon's laughter and her own flat answer given back to him, of a repaired instrument strap and a new pair of boots left without comment outside her door, of a breechful delivered by lantern light, and a hall full of ranchers who had, in the end, trusted her numbers over a frightened man's fear, of 2 years spent guarding her heart carefully against the risk of losing anyone else the way she'd lost her father, and found, standing here now, that the guarding had quietly stopped feeling necessary somewhere in these past months. Without her marking the exact day it happened. "I don't need the time," she said. "Yes, that's what I want." Neither of them moved for a moment, the two words settling into the room the way words do when they have been a long time arriving and land finally exactly as plain as they were meant to. And then Caleb crossed the workbench, slow and careful, the way he was careful with everything that mattered to him. And Josephine did not step back. And outside the cold held the valley in its grip the way it did every winter in that country, indifferent to what had just been decided inside 4 warm walls. And inside those walls neither of them minded that indifference at all, because, for the first time in a long while, neither one needed the town's opinion or anything else to know exactly what had just happened between them. It had happened. That was enough. By the time the frost broke and true spring came down over Cedar Bend, the fever had run its course through the valley, leaving loss behind it the way any hard winter does, but far less loss than it might have claimed if a frightened town had gotten its way that night. At the Grange Hall, and the ranchers who had once stood ready to destroy their own herds, out of panic now spoke of that meeting, when they spoke of it at all, with the particular embarrassment of people remembering a fear they were glad had not been allowed to win. The wedding had been small, held at the same Grange Hall where the town's opinion of Josephine had turned itself around for good, and Otis Kane, of all people, had insisted on hosting the modest suppers afterward at his own ranch, declaring that any woman who'd saved his stallion and delivered his prize mares full by lantern light had more than earned a proper celebration on his land. And half the valley's ranchers had come, including several who, a season before, would have counted themselves among Gideon's faction, though nobody made much mention of that particular history at a wedding, preferring instead to let the past settle quietly, the way most hard seasons eventually do. Gideon Marsh had left the valley within a month of the Grange Hall meeting, his trading business too damaged by his own outbreak, and his own reputation too damaged by his own scheming to recover in a town that had, in the end, seen through both plainly enough. And Cedar Bend, watching him go, found it had very little left to say about him at all, which struck more than one person as the closest thing to a verdict the man was ever likely to receive. The shingle outside the clinic had been repainted that spring. C. Reeve. Horse doctor replaced with a new one, freshly lettered, reading Reeve and Hale. Horse doctors. The letters even and unhurried the way Caleb did most things. And Josephine had stood a long while in front of it, the morning it went up, running her fingers once over the fresh paint, thinking of the notice she'd answered a year before, and the laughter that had followed her down the street toward this same building, and finding she did not mind that memory anymore, because the ending of it had changed enough that it no longer stung to remember the beginning. Her father's satchel hung now beside a second one Caleb had commissioned for her that spring, newer, better suited to the work she'd grown into over the past year, though she kept the old one still, oiled and maintained exactly as her father had taught her, not for use anymore, so much as for the memory of the hands that had carried it before hers. And some quiet evenings, closing up the clinic after a long day's rounds, she would run her thumb over the worn leather the way she once had the new stitching on the repaired strap, and feel, in that small habit, the particular comfort of a life that had honored where it came from, while still finding room enough to grow past it. On a warm evening near the start of that first summer together, the two of them sat out on the clinic steps after the last patient of the day had gone home sound, the valley settling into evening around them, horses grazing quiet in the near pasture, and Caleb, watching the light go long and gold across the fields, said without much preamble that he supposed the valley owed her an apology. It would probably never get around to giving properly, for the laughing that first morning, and Josephine said she'd stopped waiting on that particular apology a long while back, that the town's changed opinion of her, earned rather than given, had turned out to be worth considerably more than an apology could have been. Anyway, and Caleb, turning that over the way he turned over most things, allowed that she had a point, and reached over and took her hand, and the two of them sat a while longer on the steps as the light went down, needing nothing further from the valley than what it had already, slowly and honestly, come to give them both, patient as any good fever finally breaking after its long, hard season, leaving behind it not scars alone, but the particular strength that only comes from having weathered something difficult together, and found each other, still standing steady on the other side of it, together, exactly as they intended to remain. And that was the story of Josephine Hale, a horse doctor's daughter, who walked into Cedar Bend with nothing but her father's old satchel, and a notice half the town laughed at her for answering, and who proved, one sick and dying animal at a time, exactly what a steady hand and a strong stomach could accomplish, regardless of who doubted the hands holding the instruments, until the fever that once threatened to define her instead became the thing that finally, and for good, changed everyone's mind. Let me know in the comments if you enjoyed this one. Thank you.